This sounds like a classic podcast episode for us.
Yeah.
I was just
returning to some of our classic themes.
Welcome back to the Firebrand Podcast. I'm Maggie Ulmer, and I'm here with
David Watson.
Sky Kisker.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, lady.
Hello.
What's going on today?
Lots of stuff, but we still want to put in a pitch for giving for hurricane relief, and it looks like Florida is about to get hammered again. North Carolina is still digging out lots and lots of damage there. You can, if you'd like to, give at globalmethodist.org/give. Just designate your gift for where you want it to go. But in Florida, the conference superintendent there, Jay Therrell, is suggesting that we give through a group called the Faith Responders, and you can give there through thefaithresponders.org. That's thefaithresponders.org. So please be generous in helping out these folks who are affected by this terrible weather in the southeast. It's really a huge amount of devastation there. As at the time we're recording, the hurricane hasn't hit in Florida yet, but I think what I'm hearing is there's going to be a lot of damage there, a lot of water, and very, very high winds.
Did you get an email from Jay Therrell?
No, I don't think I did.
Oh.
No.
I was going to say, could you forward that on to me?
No, but he's been making appeals on Facebook for this. So,
which will be a problem for me.
Jay, we're praying for y'all in Florida and also in Georgia and North Carolina.
Yeah.
No, there's just been a lot of damage done.
Some of South Carolina too.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah. Today, I thought we would talk about an article by a guy named Ryan Burge. I think that Ryan Burge is a very insightful guy. He is a sociologist and also a member, he's clergy in the American Baptist Church. He has a Substack that's called Graphs About Religion. You can find it at graphsaboutreligion.com. So good branding
Super
there, Ryan.
Creative, but good, yeah.
And
helpful.
He provides a lot of just hard data on the state of the church, which I really appreciate because there's all kinds of anecdotal evidence for things. People say, I talked to my great niece the other day and she said this, and so the church should do this.
Yeah.
Well,
this is what the young people want.
Right. Maybe your great niece is an aberration. So,
or maybe a heretic, also possible.
or an aberrant heretic.
Oh, gosh.
So there is a recent post on Burge's website called "I'm an Evangelical, but I rarely go to church." Now that's in quotation marks because Burge is not an evangelical. I don't think he would self-identify in that way. And he does go to church. He was a pastor for a while. But then the subtitle is "When Religious Belonging and Religious Behavior Don't Align." And so he provides some graphs, which is appropriate since we're on Graphs About Religion, to demonstrate since 2008 the number of people who identify as evangelical but who don't go to church has increased quite a bit. The number of people who self-identify as evangelical and go to church weekly has decreased. And so I'll read just a little bit of that. He says in 2008, just 3% of self-identified evangelicals reported never attending religious services. Another 13% described their religious attendance as seldom. In contrast, a significant majority of evangelicals, 59%, says that they attended church at least once a week. In the 2023 data, those numbers look a lot different. The share of evangelicals who never attend has more than tripled to 10%, and then an additional 17% attend seldom. Meanwhile, the share who are weekly attenders now stands at exactly 50%. In 2008, 16% were attending less than once a year. In 2023, it was 27%. In 2008, 59% were attending at least once a week. In 2023, it was 50%. Now, those increases are significant. They're not earth-shattering, but they are significant. The percentage of people who identify as evangelicals, but who attend church at least once a week, has gone down. So there are more people who call themselves evangelicals who rarely or never go to church than there were in 2008. Is that all clear?
Clear as mud. No,
Yeah.
it's clear, actually.
Yeah, it is clear.
So, so what do we think about this? What's going on here? And he identifies one of the main, I guess, data points as political affiliation.
Yeah.
He says that people who identify as conservative are more likely to be among the group that calls itself evangelical but doesn't go to church. So a lot to work with here, a lot to think about. He provides a huge amount of data in this article, which is actually really helpful if you have the time to just sift through it all. But I think some of this has to do with the way in which people today understand the term evangelical. And I would say over the last 20 years, the term evangelical has had a political connotation for a while. I would say at least since the 80s, maybe longer. But when in the Reagan years, when Ralph Reed and others were getting going with the moral majority, when you had, Pat Buchanan wasn't an evangelical, but he was what you might call the religious right. Mm-hmm. He was Roman Catholic, but he's still alive, isn't he? So he is Roman Catholic, mm-hmm. I assume. But it seems like the term evangelical reflects political affiliation more than it did.
Yeah.
Maybe 20 years ago. Do you all have any thoughts on this?
I don't think the Christian sort of nationalist argument is very compelling. But I do think that among conservatives, having the moniker of evangelical is less socially isolating than it is among moderates or progressives. So that very few progressives would be willing to identify themselves as evangelical.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the 90s...
So there's fewer people who would be willing to take on that moniker, and thus more of those people who are willing to say, yeah, I'm an evangelical, are not actually practicing Christians. Because it's not a big deal to say, and I think you're right, though, about the fact that the term evangelical probably used to imply that you were a serious Christian. And in the era of, mega churchdom, the demands of most evangelical churches in 2024 are roughly equivalent to the demands of mainline churches in 1984 when I was a mainline Christian. So I just think there's basically, back in 1984, everyone I knew was a member of some church, most of them members of mainline churches who didn't demand very much of you. And now if you are a member of a church, the mainline has collapsed, you're probably a member of some, quote, evangelical, unquote, church, but also that church makes no demands on you whatsoever, except to attend a performance weekly. And even then, the percentage of people who attend weekly has plummeted.
I think that one of the things that is hard for me to wrap my mind around with this subject is just what people mean when they say evangelical, which, the term has been under interpretation for several years now. And so that's part of what I'm thinking about right now. Just, who obviously, like he says himself at the end of this article, it's like, I don't own the word evangelical, so I might have a theological sort of definition that I apply to it, but that may or may not be what people who self-identify as evangelical would agree with. I think I certainly see what Scott is saying, and there's no doubt that the term has become used more and more as a political sort of foil or a political identifier. So,
although the largest group of people largest ethnic group that self-identifies as evangelical would be black, who would also not be considered conservative politically. So that
in most cases,
in most cases, right? Yeah. As a general, a statistical rule. Obviously, there's exceptions to everything. But
so you're stating something that is demonstrated statistically in this study that Ryan Burge is citing here. This is part of the article. So that's interesting also.
On the webpage of the National Association of Evangelicals, they define what an evangelical is according to what's called the Bebbington Quadrilateral.
Yep, David Bebbington.
So Methodist, there's the second quadrilateral in case you were really, in case
longing
you needed
for
more,
another one.
Needed more
Because
quadrilaterals.
one wasn't enough.
We don't need any more.
This is from the work of the historian David Bebbington, and he defines evangelicalism by 4 characteristics. One is conversionism, the belief that lives need to be transformed through a born-again experience and a lifelong process of following Jesus. The second is biblicism, a high regard for and obedience to the Bible as the ultimate authority. The next is activism, the expression and demonstration of the gospel in missionary and social reform efforts. And then finally, crucicentrism, a stress on the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross as making possible the redemption of humanity. And then they say, these distinctives and theological convictions define us, not political, social, or cultural trends. In fact, many evangelicals rarely use the term evangelical to describe themselves, focusing simply on the core convictions of the triune God, the Bible, faith, Jesus, salvation, evangelism, and discipleship.
I think that's interesting. Here's what that last part, I have a strong internal reaction to that. Most evangelicals, if you don't use a term, it will be hijacked. Like, if you are not willing to inhabit and advocate and present yourself in a particular way, saying, no, this is what this is, it will get hijacked by someone else. So the term, if that's true, then what are we left to understand about the term evangelical? Well, it's been inhabited by something else. And clearly, I think it's pretty obvious, it would be hard to deny that it has been inhabited by a strong political ideology.
Okay, we're back. We had a technical difficulty because I'm using the oldest computer in the world to
And whose fault is that?
record this podcast.
You guys, we just lost 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes?
And Maggie laid out for us all her feelings about Donald Trump and all her feelings about Barack Obama.
That's false.
And it just went away into the ether.
And if that were true, then that would be a sign of God's grace. But it's not true.
Why would that be a sign of God's grace?
Because
Yeah, Maggie.
I do not want to live through the tweets and emails of if anybody ever did know those things.
So, Scott, what were you saying about, since we lost Maggie's whole big thing, but
No.
now at least we know what she thinks about everything.
No, you don't. I don't like you.
Isn't that what you're going to be talking about at the next Spirit and Truth conference?
No, for sure not.
Good Lord.
I think what I was saying was that there is a decline in Protestantism generally that hit mainline Protestantism about 20 years, 30 years before it hit, quote, evangelical, unquote, Protestantism, which is low expectations in the church and a performative understanding of what it means to be, or a consumeristic, I should say, passive understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And I mean, even, what does attending church in 2024 mean the same thing that it did for an evangelical in 1984? I guarantee you, in 1984, the people I knew who were evangelical were in church at least 3 days a week, minimum.
What was the third day? I get the midweek, the Sunday.
They would have maybe
Oh.
they would have youth group on another, and there would be Wednesday night Bible study and prayer meeting.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, I mean, they just were always at church. Mainline Christians, guess how often they went to church? Once a week,
Yeah.
at the most.
For an hour.
Maybe their kids went to youth group. The adults didn't go to Sunday school, generally speaking. That was only for children. And we've sort of seen that now. That is now what was the pattern in 1984 in mainline churches is now the pattern in 2024 in, quote, evangelical churches. Sunday school's at the same time as the church service. Parents give their kids off. Kids don't worship. Maybe kids will go to youth group some other night of the week. But you're in and done in an hour, and it's mostly passive.
At our church, there was adult Sunday school growing up.
I'm not,
Yeah.
and there was in my church. My parents just didn't.
My dad was a Sunday school teacher.
For the adults.
Yeah. They were called the Joy class because they had a lot of joy.
They were joyful. Well, good. I mean, I actually love the idea that you would name all your classes after one of the virtues or fruit of the Spirit, and you would thereby teach people what is the fruit of the Spirit in the process of your own construction.
Yes,
of these
we're
things.
in the forbearance class.
The long-suffering class.
Right.
No, you both
We're
need
the
to be in
long
the
sufferers.
self-control class.
I need to be in that class. That's for sure.
So one of the things I think is interesting is that this survey makes no mention of COVID, which has been the subject of many surveys about church attendance. I mean, which makes sense because this is about church attendance over a number of years. 2020 is mentioned, but not the impact of COVID.
Well, but I mean, there's just not. I mean, there isn't a huge impact for the on the graphs, right? The share of public who are self-identified as evangelicals who attend church seldom or never among college-educated folks, college graduates, has actually reduced since 2020.
Yeah.
And it's among non-educated or high school or less folks, it has increased, but not dramatically. It's mostly flat since 2020. And it was mostly, the high point before that is probably 2014 or something. So all that to say, I'm not sure, looking at these graphs, you can't immediately perceive that COVID had any impact at all.
So here's a paragraph here, though. We were talking earlier about whether or not this is driven by politics or not. And he did write about that. And so it says, let's see, in 2008, the gap between liberals and conservatives was pretty small in terms of, people who identify as evangelicals but don't attend church. About 5.5% of conservatives were low-attending evangelicals compared to 3.5% of liberals in the same sample. Over time, the ideological gap continues to widen. By 2012, it was about 3.5 percentage points. By 2016, more than 5 points. In the data collected over the last couple of years, it's grown into a chasm. So then it says, in 2023, 12.6% of conservatives are evangelicals who attend church seldom or never. So this is conservatives. That's interesting. That's an increase of 7 points in 2008. For liberals, the share who are low-attending evangelicals was 4.5%, and that's an increase of single percentage points from 2008.
Okay, so here's my interpretation of this graph.
Okay, well, he says...
I know what he says.
Okay.
But go ahead and you can say what he says.
So he interprets it as a politically driven change.
Right.
Go ahead.
And I would not interpret it as a politically driven change. I would interpret it as that basically the cohort that you identify with as liberal or moderate or conservative. Like if you identify as that, in 2008 there is less of a negative perception of being evangelical if you're conservative.
Mm-hmm.
The number of evangelicals among conservatives is declining.
Right.
And the number of evangelicals who still consider themselves conservative but don't go to church is increasing.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that there is a lag. There's a number of people who still call themselves evangelical because in their social circle it's fine to be considered an evangelical, but they're not actually participating. Whereas if you are a liberal in 2008, there are relatively few people considering themselves evangelical, and the social status has decreased. So those who by 2024 are in the liberal category, who still will accept the moniker of evangelical, those are serious people. Those are serious evangelicals, and they are participating. Now, they have also declined in their participation somewhat, but not to the degree that those for whom evangelical is an acceptable category in their social circles.
Okay,
but it has nothing to do with politics, really.
No.
Except that within the world of conservatism, it is not yet as socially detrimental to call yourself an evangelical as it has been in the other segments of the population.
Right, but the entire reason that it would be considered detrimental to refer to yourself as evangelical or, frankly, any other sort of Christian label is because it is seen as politically bad. Like, it's because of politics, it's because of the political atmosphere that it's become, and social atmosphere, that it's become a negative thing. So that's how I don't see how this is not actually related to some of the social and political shifts. I understand I agree with your point. Let me just say this, and then you can tell me how wrong I am. I agree. You're like, no problem, my favorite thing. I agree that the church has not done its job in formation. And I agree with what you're saying in terms of the mainline, the same trajectory of the mainline church. But part of what was missing from the thing I said before is how people organize themselves and unify themselves. So if the church is not saying, hey, we need to be unified around high expectations of investment in the tenets of the faith, discipleship, participation in spiritual disciplines, Jesus is it, we lift Jesus up and all come. They're going to unify themselves around something, some social thing. Well, I mean, if the last 10 years has demonstrated nothing, it's demonstrated that the second most practiced religion in this country is politics. So I'm speaking in broad generalities, totally can own that, but from where I'm sitting, politics has hijacked the religious impulses of our culture.
I agree with that.
And you think that you would argue that those who identified as evangelical in 2008 are significantly different politically from the majority of those who identify themselves as evangelical in 2024?
I mean, I don't know, but I think that enough has shifted and there has been enough sort of like extreme rhetoric in the public sphere about those who identify as religiously conservative that it could scare a number of people off. I mean, there's been a lot of different things at stake.
Well, I mean, yes, in the sense, and I agree that that's the part of the reason that the overall graph of the numbers of people who are willing to say that they're evangelical has gone down.
Right.
That, to me, does not explain why those who still claim the moniker of evangelical are not going to church.
Sure.
And I would say,
it's
yes,
because of the
sure.
internal group.
I think in every group, liberal, moderate, and progressive, the numbers of people within those groups who are willing to say that I am an evangelical has declined.
Yeah.
I would also say that the reason that those few people are less and less active is because the church has adopted, seeker-sensitive kinds of stuff and has become mostly pablum and isn't making disciples, generally speaking. And so there was probably, you could do exactly the same graph. I think this would be exactly the same. All of these statistics would be the same for get rid of evangelical, but replace it with mainline, those who identify as mainline Christians who don't attend church. And you could go back and do it from 1984 to, 2004, and you would see exactly the same situation happening. Fewer and fewer people are identifying as mainline Christians. Those who do identify among groups where it is less socially acceptable to be a Christian at all are more devoted because they've got to endure, they've got to get through the social, they're serious. I'm a serious mainline Christian when the rest of my primary social group thinks that that's weird. So if the rest of my social group kind of thinks it's okay, then it's, I can just call myself an evangelical or call myself a Christian or call myself anything. It doesn't hurt me to do that, but I also don't have to do anything to demonstrate it.
Sure. Talk, David.
Okay. One of the things I've been thinking about as we've been talking is think about like in the early 2000s, 1990s, one of the major figures, influential figures in American Christianity was Jim Wallis. And Jim Wallis started Sojourners, and he started it maybe in the 80s, not in the 70s.
No, it was in the 70s.
It was in the 70s? So it had been around for a long time.
What was the name of the magazine before it was Sojourners? Anyway.
But Jim Wallis was a guy who self-identified unashamedly as evangelical and also took a lot of more progressive, let's say, economic positions, And one of the props he would use was, I assume, by the way, I don't know for sure, I assume he was conservative, at least for a lot of his career, on human sexuality. But one of the props he would use, he would hold up a Bible with a big chunk cut out of it and say, this is the Bible with all the passages about money cut out of it. And so
Right.
what his big thing was, you need to vote for policies that help the poor if you're a Christian. And he identified most of those with the Democratic Party. And I was just thinking, that's not something you would really, that's not a phenomenon that would emerge now.
Right, but and incidentally, it was 1971
It was 1971?
that the
Wow.
magazine started, and it was at that time called the Post-American.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
But in any case, back then, too, what percentage of the Democratic Party was sort of working class, high school or lower educated people who also were, if they were Protestant, self-identifying as evangelical?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, what percentage of African Americans at that time would identify with a more, what we would say today, kind of progressive, which, ironically now, of course, Trumpism is focusing very much on working class issues.
Mm-hmm.
We've just undergone a complete flip.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And the Democratic Party is the party of college-educated
extremely wealthy
people on the coasts.
People on the coast, exactly. So it's just the business that generates money now is not industrial, it's tech.
Mm-hmm.
And the tech billionaires, as opposed to the industrialist billionaires, tend to be Democrats. But anyway,
Interesting.
I forgot what I was trying to say. His own group basically threw him under the bus.
Right, they kicked him out.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he was too conservative.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because the Sojourners magazine itself had decided that the moniker of evangelical was not something they really wanted to retain.
Yeah, the idea of Jim Wallace being kicked out of Sojourners that really caught me off guard. I was like, I always associated Sojourners with Jim Wallace. Like, no Jim Wallace, no Sojourners. And then they kicked him out.
In the 90s, when I was in seminary, most people, you're mocking me because I'm old.
No, I'm not. I'm totally not.
Most serious Christians I knew would, in terms of popular magazines, would get, well, serious is perhaps, but they would get, what was the Wittenberg Door,
Mm-hmm.
Sojourners, and Christianity Today.
Mm-hmm.
You could be a person who subscribed to all three of those, and no evangelical would have questioned your street creds.
Right.
Wittenberg Door made fun of ourselves. We evangelicals made fun of ourselves in the Wittenberg Door. Yeah. And, Christianity Today was solidly Billy Graham Christianity down the line. And Sojourners was also Christian, but with Jesus-y perspectives on how we should, love our neighbor who is struggling. That world has changed to some degree.
Yeah, and Christianity today just gets hammered now for being quote unquote woke. And I read Christianity Today. I have a subscription, and I don't see it. I don't see the wokeness.
Well, that's because you're
out.
woke.
Yeah, that's it.
Woke people
That's
never
it.
see
That's
wokeness.
It. Yeah, it's like fish don't know they're in water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Gosh.
No, I think that is an unfair critique of Christianity Today. Maybe they write things that you don't agree with politically, not you, just the rhetorical one doesn't agree with politically, but I just don't see it. But hey, but in a way that's kind of how Christianity Today has sort of always been, in the sense that they kind of they've not been a fundamentalist magazine, but they have been an evangelical magazine. And I think that they're still trying to occupy that space, but maybe I'm missing something, but I just don't see it. I don't think that's a fair critique of Christianity today. If they've published things that are more progressive than some readers like, okay, but, in the big spectrum of Christian theology, they don't seem progressive to me. I've spent a lot of time with progressives, and Christianity today ain't it.
I mean, Christianity Today, again, would be a magazine, would have people within its orbit who are attractive to progressivism, but want to maintain the moniker of evangelical. And again, it's sort of the problem. This is David Bevington's success and his problem with defining evangelicalism. He rejects a priori this idea that fundamentalism, which is a doctrinal definition of what it means to be evangelical, is what evangelical is, and he argues for this pietistic understanding of evangelicalism as conversionist, biblicist, activist. Now, here's the thing with activism. It doesn't tell you which things you're going to be active on.
Yeah.
You're active in whatever society you're in to do things that Jesus would want. That can be protect the lives of the unborn. It can also be protecting the lives of those who are in slavery by trying to criminalize slavery. It can be, there's so many things that it can be, right?
This is why we should all just be Methodists.
Right, that's the conclusion that we should come to here.
I'm just saying, Wesley was specific.
Well, I mean, Methodists have in history, used their political and coercive power to to criminalize alcohol.
Yes, I know.
As well as slavery. Now, we all say one of those things is a good thing that it should be criminalized, and one of those things was a bad thing that it should be criminalized.
Yeah, it just turned people into criminals. So.
Well, I mean, you can say the same thing for, criminalizing all sorts of things. Gambling, for example. Blue laws, which were, all sorts of Christians who wanted to make the kingdom of God more manifest in this world through political means have done such things, which includes this country and Britain and other places criminalizing slaveholding.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that I would, and I'm not saying that you're doing this, but I'm saying I think that morally slaveholding and blue laws are not, they don't have the same impact necessarily. I think, we could have debates. I think
one is a bit weightier
than
the other.
That's where I'm going with that. One of the things that is interesting to me about this conversation, and I'm just listening, is how much sort of like how many things have shifted. Like here we are talking about the late 90s. Like I started to laugh, not because I'm mocking you, because you're old, Scott. We can do that anytime. But and
you do.
but because the sort of the social psychological landscape we live in right now is so different. I just think about, in some ways, what you're describing, the spectrum of those three magazines, which I never read Wittenberg Door, but I certainly read Sojourners and Christianity Today, still read Christianity Today off and on. But I mean, what you're sort of describing, that spectrum there sort of encapsulates, David, what you like to talk about with classical liberalism, is just the idea that that we can discuss things based on the merit of ideas, not necessarily on the ideological alignment. And that is just not how we evaluate the merit of things it seems like it's not anymore.
That in my experience is increasingly rare.
Yeah.
That
What
we-
is that in the sentence?
The classical, what we're calling the classical liberal perspective, where you evaluate ideas based on arguments
Yeah.
instead of emoting about them or calling names or engaging in ad hominem or these kinds of
Or just or sort of like aligning yourself with wherever there seems to be the most brute strength, whether that's politically, socially, you know. I think it's just strange.
I mean, politics is all about coercion.
Sure.
So it's all about brute strength. It's
Well-
all about having the numbers to impose your will on the rest of the population
Yeah, but we
through coercion, through
Well-
the laws of the land.
right. I mean, another word we could use is through enforcement or through
There's no difference between enforcement and coercion.
well, and enforcement of laws. I mean, we live in a democratic republic. I mean, we have a legislative system. We have a
Right, and that's the mechanism by which
yes,
the state coerces people to behave in certain ways.
sure.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is there is an additional layer of coercion that is not about legislation, that is simply about almost like social purity tests. You know, you see this all the time on social media.
It's an informal coercion.
That's right.
It's kind of an honor shame thing.
Right.
You shame people you publicly shame them into shutting up.
Right. And so that's not about evaluating the merits of ideas. That is exactly and only about power. Whereas, you know, when we engage in a political system where somebody says, well, here's the platform that I'm running on, here are the ideas that I'm getting behind, whatever, you can choose. You can say, okay, I'm going to align myself with that candidate or this candidate. But I think that part of what we're discussing here is the idea that there are people who are like, I'm willing to forego my convictions because I feel that it's socially dangerous.
I think that's very common. I think that's very common. People do not want to be shamed, and social media is a powerful force for the shaming of people and exerting social control. And the only way that you can fight back against that is to just say, you can say whatever you want about
Yeah.
me, but I'm just going to keep talking.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't care about being shamed.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of the same thing, isn't
Yeah.
it? I mean, I will not be coerced into shutting up.
So I think, as I've listened to this conversation too, I think that in some ways what we're describing here, like what you're describing, and these are like flip sides of the same coin. I mean, I think the people who are willing to hang in there, those are serious evangelicals. And also people, because there has not been a strong conviction in the church for formation, then people are more willing, their convictions are not as deeply rooted, they're willing to compromise them.
And before we end this podcast, I want to say, if you call yourself an evangelical or a Christian of any kind, you need to get to church.
Yeah.
Go to church.
And
Like-
better yet, join a small group, where someone will watch over you in love.
See, we should
and
just
ask
all be
you,
Methodists.
the requisite questions about how your soul is going
But you
on
need,
a regular
you need
basis.
you need to have a Christian community
Yeah,
around
definitely.
you. You need to engage in the public worship of God. You need to hear the Scripture preached, and you need to receive the sacrament, Holy Communion. And if you haven't been baptized, you need to be baptized. And if people aren't doing that, then they are neglecting, first of all, a primary duty of the faith, but secondly, they're neglecting the means of grace.
Right.
They're neglecting those means by which God works in their lives to make them holier people. Mm-hmm. And so when you worship God together, God, the Holy Spirit, works within you to make you a different kind of person. When you receive Holy Communion, when you receive good preaching, or biblical preaching, I should say. These things are important. And so, get thee to church, evangelicals. Don't skip church. I mean, everyone does once in a while, right? But
Well, I rarely do.
Well,
Yeah.
you're the pastor.
I know. But I don't. I mean, even if I'm not at
Yeah.
my own church,
I know. I
go.
don't like missing
if
church.
I'm in town, I'm going to church.
Yeah,
And
well-
even if I'm out of town, I'll try to find a church.
Yeah, that's
Which is not that difficult because there are usually churches in most places of the world.
You know, there are. There are.
yes, there are.
Yep, indeed.
Well, this has been an interesting conversation. You know, sort of a classic throwback to culture. There's a study.
Hitting some of our major themes.
Yeah.
Well, and I do want to say one more thing. That the graph that I think is most illustrative of this
Okay.
is that in 2008, moderates and conservatives basically didn't go to church at the same rate. Mm-hmm. And the best going evangelicals were liberals. Mm-hmm. They went. Mm-hmm. The moderates increased from 5 to 8, conservatives from 5% to 12%, liberals 3.5 to 4.5.
Yes, this is the same.
Those who will take on this mantle of evangelical, who are in cultures where that is most socially not advantageous, are the most dedicated to that double identity. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, all I'm saying is we all have multiple identities, mm-hmm. and if those two, when those two come into some sort of conflict, we have to make choices mm-hmm. about what's important.
Yeah.
When they don't come into conflict, we can be kind of lackadaisical, both about what it means to be a conservative, which today, I don't even know what that means anymore, right? It doesn't mean really what it did in, 1982 either. So, and I would say liberal doesn't mean what it did in 1982 either. So all of these identifiers have kind of shifted and changed. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm sorry that I did that. We can cut that out.
We don't have to cut that out.
Okay,
That's fine.
sorry.
Yeah.
Well, that's been our podcast for today. Interesting conversation. You guys can go to Ryan Burge's Substack and read the article for yourselves and see what you think.
Titled, I'm an evangelical, but I rarely go to church.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Well, we'll come back to you in the next conversation. Bye.